I'd like to hear your view in hindsight. How close do you think that Russia was actually in those 30 days to pulling off its initial war aim of quick military victory, followed by an imposed pro-Russian government? And to what extent do you think it was about a few perhaps accidental things that could have went a different way than they did? Or to what extent do you think that it was almost certain that it had ended up happening the way it did?
Here's what I mean on the first 2 days. I think there are a lot of wrong impressions that came out of the first 30 days of the war, even the first year, and unfortunately they stuck around. And early impressions have anchoring effects, right? And then it takes a very long time to correct those narratives. It is problematic because it takes us a long time to establish what actually happened and why in the war, right? If you are a student of military history like I am, we are still debating what happened in World War II and World War I. And I have historian friends that still debate what happened in the Napoleonic Wars. And I have other friends that still debate what happened during the period of Kabinettskrieg all the time. Okay. So that's why I would say when it comes to defense and military analysis, be patient with military analysts following this war in trying to establish what happened yesterday or a year ago, if we're still having these debates about World War II and revisionist narratives and people trying to explain to other historians how the war was won and then them explaining to themselves again how the war was really won. So we look at first 30 days. I think we do know quite a bit. Part of the reason why is we have a lot of primary source evidence. We have a lot of accounts from Russian and Ukrainian sides, and we have enough to establish most of what I think we need to know, although there are still missing gaps about certain battles. First is it's clear that the Russian plan, the way they're employing the forces, is very different from the way folks had expected, including myself. Meaning there was a good sense and the right call on the scope of the Russian operation, what they were trying to achieve, right? But not the way they were actually going to go about it, what their assumptions were, how they would employ their forces. That said, on the Ukrainian side, a big part of the assumption for why Ukraine would lose the conventional war, initial period of war, and this is my view as well. In my mind, I was ballparking that the initial phase could last anywhere between, 4 to 8 weeks. And this was clearly wrong. I want to be clear. I don't believe anybody other than Mark Milley thought that Russians could take Kiev in 3 days. It's just a myth. And I don't think there's any assessment that's going to substantiate that because it sounds a bit silly. And it's important to keep in mind that what senior political leaders said, because of the urgency of the Russian invasion and focusing on a worst case scenario, a lot of people did that. And I did that to some extent myself in the run-up to the war, was because in our own country, in the United States, there were many people that didn't think this war was still going to happen, despite all the intelligence that was out there. Second, Europeans didn't agree and had a different interpretation, especially the Germans and the French, right? So it was very difficult to galvanize a response to a likely Russian invasion if your leading allies say, I don't think an invasion is going to happen. The German chief of intelligence is in Kiev on the night of the invasion. He is so confident that the U.S. is wrong that he's actually there that night and has to figure out how to get out of Kiev once the Russian assault comes, right? And that has to do with the history of Iraq. And folks were strong proponents of that invasion and the basis for that invasion that led to a lot of U.S. credibility issues for the following 20 years. That's a conversation for another time. So the other big issue is that Ukrainian government was in denial, abject denial about the fact that the war was coming. And a lot of folks in the Ukrainian military thought that if the war would come, it would be focused on the Donbass. So there wasn't really much of anybody defending Kiev other than the presidential brigade, a couple special forces units that night, on the night of the invasion. And you had a lot of Ukrainian units focused in the east, in the Donbass part of the country, but much of the rest of the country unprepared. Air defense units that only got sorted out of garrison that night. To say that Ukraine was prepared to receive a large-scale invasion from Russia on that night in February is just patently false. And even if you look at the initial Russian strike campaign against Ukrainian air defense, that night they hit every known radar position. Many Ukrainian air defense units got out within hours or minutes of Russian missiles arriving to where the radars were located. If you look at kind of sort of Russian expectations, they thought they were going to catch Ukraine cold because mobilization was only declared a few days before, and units were sorted out by the Ukrainian leadership that day. That is the day of the invasion. Ukrainian reserves were still in the western part of the country. This is a big challenge. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a longer story, but if we were to trade places, right, and you were trying to think through expectation assumptions for the war, it's true that quite a bit was contingent, and there was a tendency to emphasize worst case scenarios. And part of that was, again, because there was still a state of denial. And many of my friends who were in Kiev from journalist circles were sending pictures of themselves drinking that night, saying, hey, where's the war? And I was sort of wide-eyed looking at it, thinking, okay, well, we are existing in two states of realities, and my reality is about to crash into my colleague's reality. Okay. But quite a bit was contingent. And the reason for that was, first, although there was no good way to assess what the Russian intelligence operation and their ground game in Ukraine, which was significant. They had operatives and saboteurs in place. They had moved them 6 to 8 months before the launch of the invasion. They rented apartments for them across the outskirts of Kiev and other areas. There are reasons for why the South fell very rapidly in the first 24 hours, and Mariupol was encircled within hours of the invasion, and why Russian forces advanced relatively unopposed until they got halfway from Kherson to Nikolaev, and why they took Luhansk so quickly too. If you look at how differently that campaign went in the south and southeast compared to how it went in the north and northeast of the country, there were things that Russians thought they had paid for that happened that clearly broke their way, if that makes any sense. That is, they did not hallucinate the intelligence operation they had and the people they thought they had paid off. And Ukraine conducted extensive investigations afterwards to figure out what happened to try to roll up this network. So it's difficult to factor it. But the military operation didn't make sense if they hadn't set the conditions for this rapid takeover, and they hadn't set the conditions. It collapsed. And they were woefully optimistic about what they could achieve. They were trying to do something closer to a large-scale annexation of Crimea, or kind of like a cheaper knockoff of Operation Danube, the seizure of Czechoslovakia. But the key battles, Hostomel, the first 24 hours, the battle for Chernihiv, where 1st Tank Brigade with National Guard, territorial defense, and other support held off a lot of the central military district, those were key battles that went Ukraine's way early on, and those outcomes were not overdetermined. And folks tend to assume that whatever timeline they live in, right, was the most likely, the highest probability outcome of history. But that's not true. You don't know for a fact that you're not living in the 20% probability outcome, right? So it may seem natural to you looking back in history that, let's say 1940, Germany defeats Britain and France in a matter of weeks, right, on the Western Front. But I don't think anybody would have called that in 1939. Certainly Britain and France didn't. If you look at all the available metrics, Britain and France should have been able to hold Germany off, right? At least that was their assumption. Not too many analytical accounts in the run-up to 1940 saying that Germany is going to defeat France and we're going to get Dunkirk, right, in a matter of weeks. So I'm just using this as a example of contingent history. Now that history kind of makes sense, it's locked into our memory, right? But it could have gone another way. So when I look back on all of this, yes, the outcome was quite contingent. Ukrainian colleagues, many of them who were there in these battles, agreed that, not to paraphrase Wellington, but it was a damn close thing, the way it played out. In retrospect, while they asked, how could you think that we would have lost within a few days? I say, well, you should have heard yourself in those first few days. You weren't sure how it was going to go. You were pretty uncertain. So, and everybody I know was too. But the Russian campaign was deeply problematic. There were a lot of problems in Russian force quality and force employment. That said, a lot of the challenges were not due to our gross overestimation of Russian military capability, right? Because remember, abstract assessments of military power is context dependent. It really depends on the scenario. There's no such thing as like an abstract measure of military power. You could be off on what you think a military can do because you haven't seen it, or you haven't seen it in that particular context. That's true. I think we got a lot wrong about the Russian military and course corrected pretty quickly. But I think some folks read way too much into what happened in the first 30 days and sort of misunderstood why it happened that way. And then assumed that the entire field of kind of Russian military analysis was off and that we don't know anything about Russian military. And lastly, a lot of the thinking I think back then was in part due to poor knowledge of the Ukrainian forces, but also fairly weak preparation on the Ukrainian side, at least what you could observe. So it's been very hard. Now, if we were to have this discussion, right, on the night leading up to February 24th, and we were to look objectively at the state of Ukraine military preparation to receive this invasion, I think you would have been very hard-pressed as an analyst to explain why you think Ukraine will easily defeat the Russian invasion, other than you have really positive vibes about the situation. Right? And so I think that's the other challenge when I look back on it. I do think quite a bit of it was contingent, and I do think that there were big factors like many volunteers on the Ukrainian side that stalled the Russian advance, that came forward, that took up arms, and it was Ukrainian society that bought invaluable time for the rest of the military effort in those early days. And there were a lot of things that I don't think we necessarily expected, or maybe expected but didn't know how to account for. And here I'm speaking of myself just as an outside objective analyst. I was not involved in any of the government assessments of this thing in the run-up to it.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal. The stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.